But I think going forward, I think I still prefer Jeremy Hill just because of when it gets colder. They're going to run the ball a lot more than they are right now. Speaking of that passing game too, Andy Dalton has been lighting it up. I know like Aaron Rodgers for a while was getting all the headlines of what he was doing, but I mean Dalton has been, I believe he's near the top as far as fantasy points for quarterbacks right now. Is he a top 10 quarterback going forward, or you think this is just a couple weeks that Andy Dalton will give us and then he'll go back to being Andy Dalton?
I think he's actually third among quarterbacks, which amazes me because I'm not an Andy Dalton guy whatsoever. And I don't see him even being a top 10 by the end of the year. I think, like you're saying, once it gets cold, I think the running game is going to pick up and Dalton's going to throw a lot less.
Yeah, I'm with you on that too. I'm not quite buying into Dalton. I think as a week-to-week sort of matchup play, I think he can be good. But when it starts getting colder and, he starts playing some of these teams that are actually hungry for playoff spots, and I think Dalton's going to go back to being Dalton. I think he did this to us last year, maybe the year before. We had like 4 games that were just ridiculous. I mean, he was throwing for like 400 yards, 3 or 4 touchdowns a game. He was like lighting it on fire, and then all of a sudden he just crashed and burned, and he was throwing interceptions on the same rate that he was throwing touchdowns. So I think we need to be careful with Dalton and fall in love with him. But I think right now, with the weather the way it is, I think he's definitely a good play. I've actually had Dalton in my lineups, my DFS lineups the last couple of weeks, and he's definitely paid off for me. So Dalton, I think right now is good, but don't stake your entire fantasy season on Dalton right now. All right, moving on to the Redskins at the Falcons. With Deshaun Jackson going down, of course, Pierre Garçon has been pretty good. I mean, considering his quarterback play, considering they want to run the ball, he's been fantasy relevant, and I don't think anybody really picked him to be fantasy relevant going into the season. Do we think he's an every week starter now, or do you think it's matchup only?
He's a matchup-based guy for me. I mean, he's doing really good, but that's without Deshaun Jackson. And then before we even started here, I saw where Jordan Reed not only has a concussion, but he also has a knee injury. So Garcon could be a good play this week, and both DFS and season long. But going forward, especially when Jackson comes back, he'll be a matchup-based guy for me.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I actually had Garcon higher than most going into the season. I think people forget that a couple years ago he actually led the league in receptions. And I think people don't realize either that he actually had more receptions last year than Deshaun Jackson did. It's just Deshaun Jackson had, ridiculous yards per catch. I believe it was like 20-some yards per catch. So he actually had a lot more yards than Garcon. But Garcon had more targets and more receptions than Deshaun Jackson. So I think PPR league, he's definitely a weak flex play. But like you said, I think it's still matchup based, especially when Deshaun Jackson comes back. I don't think that offense, especially with the way they want to run the ball, can support 2 receivers week in and week out. And then speaking of the running game in Washington, we actually have sort of a 3-headed monster right now. You have Alfred Morris, who came into the season as the expected starter, and then of course Matt Jones kind of burst on the scene, and we thought, oh, okay, though he's the starter. And then I believe the last 2 weeks, Chris Thompson has actually out-snapped the 2 of them. Can we trust any of these running backs in Washington? Are any of them going to emerge as the lead guy there, or are we just going to have to worry about the committee the rest of the year?
I think you have to worry about a committee, honestly. But I do think you're kind of seeing the future of the running backs in Washington. I think that after this year, Alfred Morris may be done. And I see Matt Jones as more of the Alfred Morris type back, run the ball down the throat. And the other kid, he's more of your reception guy. And I think they could be a good duo. But this year, I see a committee. And the Jones actually is averaging almost 5 yards per carry. So, I mean, he could be solid, but I just don't see us having any way of knowing from week to week which one to start.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Actually, I do like Thompson as a PPR ad. I think that's kind of the trend in the NFL right now. You're going to have your big early down back that's going to pound and pound and pound, and then you're going to bring in your smaller, faster sort of receiving back, like Lance Dunbar was doing in Dallas before he went down. So I think Thompson, as far as a PPR ad, as a flex play, is definitely worth a look. But as far as who I'm starting week in and week out, you just don't know. I think I'm avoiding the situation altogether if I can. Looking over at the Falcons side of the ball, big story here, of course, is Devontae Freeman. You know, kind of busted on the scene. I sure as heck didn't pick him to be anything near what he's been. Does that make Tevin Coleman, who had the week one, pretty decent game, he had 80 yards, the rookie looked good. Then he got injured, of course, and Devontae Freeman kind of, took over the starting job. Is he droppable now, or do you think we still want to hold on to him just to see if Devontae Freeman is legit?
You got to stash Coleman on your bench. I mean, his first couple of weeks, he looked fast, he looked good, but, Freeman's putting up numbers that he's not going to go up to keep people betting. He's got 7 touchdowns already this year, and I don't see Freeman as the better back, honestly. But they're going to go with the hot hand here. So Freeman's going to be your guy for at least this week, and I think Coleman's getting close to coming back. That's what I read anyway. And I actually like Coleman more in the long run, but I wouldn't drop him just yet.
Yeah, I actually have him in a league, and going into this week, I had a bunch of guys on buys, and I debated. I'm like, do I drop him? Do I drop him? Because he's going to come back and be second fiddle. But, he's basically one injury away from being back on the field. Devontae Freeman, has been injured in the past, and I think, you have to hold on to him, if nothing more than a handcuff. If you're a Devontae Freeman owner, you definitely want to hold on to Tevin Coleman, because you're right. He did look good those first couple of weeks. He looked fast. He was hitting the hole. Actually thought I made the right decision between him and Devontae Freeman in my draft to take Coleman. Of course, I regret that decision now, but I think in the long run, I think Tevin Coleman is the better back, and I think it will emerge eventually. Maybe not this year, but maybe it'll happen next year. And speaking of guys emerging, we have, of course, Leonard Hankerson, formerly of the Washington Redskins, pretty much taking over that number 2 role from Roddy White, who hasn't really had any targets, regardless of, what he's been saying in the media, that he's frustrated and this and that. The fact is he's an older receiver, and he's just not getting it done anymore. You think Roddy White is now droppable, or we think he's going to turn it around?
I am on the drop Roddy White bandwagon. He's like the Reggie Wayne this year. He's just out there to get some attention and letting guys like Hankerson get all the catches. And then you got Julio Jones in your way, too. That guy's the best receiver in the league, in my opinion. He's only, Roddy White that is, he's only gotten 13 targets for 4 weeks. And that's nothing. So, I definitely suggest dropping Roddy White.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Actually, you mentioned the targets he's had for the entire season. And then earlier you had mentioned that DeAndre Hopkins had 22 in one game. So that kind of puts it in perspective. He's just not seeing the ball, and if he's not seeing the ball, you definitely don't want to own him. All right, moving on to what's probably going to be the worst game to watch from an NFL standpoint, but might actually have some fantasy relevance in it, and that's the Jags at the Buccaneers. Of course, we had the big sort of breakout game last week from Allen Hurns, very hot waiver wire pickup this week. Is Allen Hurns the Allen to own in Jacksonville over Allen Robinson? Or is that just a 1 week thing? It's because Allen Robinson had Revis on him the whole game?
Coming into this year, I was probably the biggest Allen Robinson fan. And I think still that he's the guy to own, because he's averaging 10 targets per game roughly. He just hasn't been able to do much with them. Hurns, on the other hand, I think he had 15 targets this last week, and that was more than the first 3 weeks combined. So I think he's kind of a mirage, if you will. He's gonna be this matchup-based guy that I'm solely gonna use in DFS, which is what I did this weekend. Actually, I grabbed him, and he's always cheap. But if I had to choose between the two, it's Allen Robinson every week.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm actually the same. I was buying heavily in some Allen Robinson stock this year in my drafts. Got him in 2 of my leagues, and I had a question this past weekend. A friend of mine was trying to figure out who he wanted to drop to pick up a kicker, because his kicker was on a bye. And one of the options he said was Allen Hurns, and I told him to drop Allen Hurns. And of course, he was cussing my name, all week, with Allen Hurns breaking out this past week. But I think it was a product of Revis. I think Revis was on Allen Robinson, and they were avoiding him. He did have some targets, but I think when you have Revis on you, you're not taking any risks. I think going forward, I think he'll be okay. He's definitely the better receiver, I think, in this offense. And Bortles has shown that he has confidence. The one game that Robinson kind of blew up, I mean, I think Bortles threw the ball 33 times, and 18 of those passes went to Allen Robinson, so more than half of his passes. So I think Robinson will be fine going forward. Of course, Bortles, he's not a very good real-life quarterback right now, but he's playing the Bucs, and he's actually throwing the ball a ton. Is he a QB streamer this week? You think he's viable as a starter if you got a quarterback on a bye?
Yeah, definitely. This week against Tampa Bay, I would stream him in every league I had a chance in. He's had 2 weeks this year where he had 2 touchdowns, which is always super valuable. I think last week I saw a stat where, I'm not sure if this is right or not, but I think he threw like 50 times or something like that last week.
Yeah, I think you're right.
The guy was pretty good for fantasy, like you said, but I think you're right. I think stream him if possible.
Yeah, I think not only am I streaming him, I think I have him in one of my big tournament lineups for FanDuel. Just throw him in there. He's super cheap right now, so I think that's a possible GPP play for y'all DFS players out there. On the Bucs side of the ball, we had 2 guys that have been sort of missing in that Bucs offense to start the season. You know, we got Vincent Jackson and Doug Martin both having huge games this past weekend. Is this a legit thing? Is this going to be a trend? Or do we think it was just a 1-week thing and we'll see Mike Evans back to being a stud? Or is Vincent Jackson and Doug Martin legit now?
Well, I actually got a good stat from Doug Martin. There's been 2 games where he's rushed 20 or more, or had 20 or more touches, and he's got 120 scrimmage yards. And then there's 2 games this season where he's got less than 20, and he only has 50 scrimmage yards. So his value all depends on how if they give him the touches, he's going to produce. And on Vincent Jackson, I'm not sold on him yet. He's always been boom or bust, and he'll be matchup based for me. But Evans is really kind of worrying me. I really thought once he got back to health that he'd be the guy, and he just hasn't really proven himself with Winston yet.
Yeah, I'm with you on that Evans call too, especially when they lost their tight end for a few weeks. I thought Evans would be the guy getting all the targets, and that just hasn't been the case. I think it might be a little bit of a chemistry issue with Jameis Winston because they weren't on the field much together through the preseason and through the beginning of the season. So I think maybe once they get their chemistry down, that you'll see some more Evans. And as far as Doug Martin, that's a really good stat with the touches. I didn't realize that that it was that case. So basically, Doug Martin becomes viable if you think the Bucs can stay in the game, which I think with the Jags they definitely can. So Doug Martin may be a good DFS play. Definitely a good play as far as season long this week. I think the matchups you're going to want to avoid are ones where you think the Bucs might get blown out because I don't think Doug Martin gets the touches in those games. But yeah, good stat on that. All right, we'll move on to the Browns and the Ravens. Of course, the big story coming out of Ravens camp is the Steve Smith injury. Definitely out for this week. We might potentially see him within a week or 2. Is there any receiver that's going to take Steve Smith's spot that we're looking at as an ad for this week? Maybe a Kamar Aiken or Marlon Brown, or is there anybody worth starting, or is it just pretty much going to be sort of a committee receiver core where no one really gets the touches?
Yeah, I say committee. They actually picked up Chris Gibbons from the Rams. I mean, he could be a spot start guy, but man, I just don't see it with these guys. It'd be nice if Rashad Perryman would come back.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I actually had Rashad Perryman pretty high on my list of rookies to start the season. I thought Steve Smith was pretty much the only receiver they had, and whoever that number 2 would be viable. And if it was Perryman, that would be even better because he's a younger guy. But I'm with you. I'm not buying a Kamar Aiken. I'm not buying Marlon Brown. They're just not number 1 receivers. I'm not really sure who they're going to pass to. It's going to be a lot of dump offs. It's a 4 set. I don't know if Crockett Gilmore is due back or not. Their tight end. Maybe it goes to him. Maybe it's just to spread it all around. Everybody gets 3 targets basically on the games, and no one's really going to be fantasy relevant. And then, of course,